This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Over the last two episodes, we talked about sacrifice and what happens after a line is crossed. We talked about compromise becoming normal, about systems learning how to live with decisions made under pressure. But today we need to ask the question that often gets buried beneath strategy, survival, and progress. Who pays the price? Not in theory, not symbolically, but practically. Because every system that survives a crisis does so unevenly. Someone is protected, someone is prioritized, and someone, often unseen, absorbs the cost. Science fiction understands this deeply. That's why so many futuristic worlds look advanced but feel cruel. The technology improves, the system stabilizes, and yet suffering doesn't disappear. It just relocated. One of the most consistent truths in science fiction is simply this: progress does not eliminate inequality, it only reorganizes it. In Elysium, Earth is polluted, overcrowded, and decaying. Meanwhile, a small elite lives in orbit, surrounded by abundance, health, and protection. The technology exists to heal everyone, but access is restricted, not because of scarcity, but because of design. The system works exactly as intended. Science fiction keeps showing us futures where suffering is solvable, hunger is unnecessary, and disease is curable. And yet, people still suffer. That's another warning. When progress is framed as success, we stop asking who that success is built on. Many science fiction stories revolve around the idea of disposable people, not villains, not rebels, just population deemed expendable. In Snowpiercer, survival depends on rigid class separation. The system only functions if some people suffer. The suffering isn't accidental, it's structural. The engine requires inequality. And what's chilling is how rational it all sounds. Characters explain the system calmly, logically, almost compassionately. And that's how disposable populations are created. Not through hatred, but through necessity. Science fiction asks, at what point does necessary becomes permanent? And how long before the people at the bottom stop being seen as people at all? In the expanse, the belt exists to support the inner planets. Belters mine resources. They work in dangerous conditions. They suffer long term physical damage, not because anyone hate them, it's because the system requires them. It's one of science fiction most important distinction. Oppression does not require cruelty. It only requires indifference. The inners don't wake up wanting belters to suffer. They just accept the benefits of a system that depends on it. And that's why the expanse feels so real. because injustice doesn't need villains, it needs convenience. Science fiction asks us to confront this. How many systems in our world function smoothly because someone else bears the cost quietly? Another way society justify unequal costs is through othering. In District 9, aliens aren't exterminated because they're dangerous. They're marginalized because they're inconvenient. They're labeled unsanitary, unmanageable, different. And once they're labeled others, their suffering becomes acceptable. Science fiction uses othering repeatedly because it's effective. Once someone is framed as, quote, less human or less capable or less deserving, their pain becomes easier to ignore. This is how systems protect themselves, not by denying harm, but by redefining who counts. One of the most important questions science fiction asks is not what did we give up, but who feels the loss most sharply. When freedoms are restricted, some people experience inconvenience, others experience surveillance. When resources are rationed, some experience discomfort, others experience deprivation. Science fiction shows us again and again the people who benefit from compromises rarely experience its worst consequences, and the people who suffer most rarely had a voice in that decision. That imbalance is not a bug, it's a feature. Many science fiction futures involve sacrifice that never was chosen. In Children of Men, despair isn't evenly shared. Those with power insinuate themselves. Those without live with collapse. Hope becomes a resource, and like all resources, is controlled. Science fiction reminds us sacrifice means something very different depending on whether you volunteered for it. When sacrifice is imposed rather than shared, resentment replaces solidarity. And once solidarity is gone, systems rely on force. The reason this question matters after sacrifice is because inequality doesn't resolve itself. If the aftermath isn't addressed, the same populations continue to pay. And the next crisis simply deepens the divide. Science fiction warns us if we don't ask who paid the price, we will repeat the pattern. And repetition is how injustice becomes tradition. Science fiction gives us one final responsibility to notice who disappears from the narrative, who becomes background, who is spoken about but never spoken with, because the future isn't judged only by what it builds, it's judged by who it carries forward and who it leaves behind. So, who pays the price? Science fiction answer isn't uncomfortable. Not everyone, not equally, and rarely by choice. And if we don't confront that truth, we mistake survival for justice. In the next episode, we're going to ask one final question in this arch. What must be reclaimed? Not erased, not forgotten, but restored. If the future is going to be worth living in, then I want you to reflect on this question. Whose suffering has become invisible in the system we depend on? And what would change if we were forced to see it? This has been the Sci-Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to imagine carefully.